remembers this since birth. And he's 40, so this will be real special to him.
Right.
You want the outside? Would you like a glass of water?
Has a lot of.
Okay.
Because things are changing now, and they will change. So you remember when this happened?
Yeah.
Having it documented in photos is almost like having a family album.
Oh, yeah. Bring you
Food and drink over to the side, folks.
Your story and your pictures make it amazing.
That was one tire too.
Thank you very much.
Find a good place to sit.
My husband likes to sit in the back, so we're in the very back.
Oh,
Okay. That's a good idea. Thank you.
So, you're out of the first printing now, besides what we have here?
Yeah, and we're sold out. We're almost sold out of the second printing, so we're printing this thing.
And what will they be?
They will be here on
Do that a lot.
probably about October the 8th. So, and that one will have actually so here we've got David Weaver, who's add Lane Hart now. He didn't quite make the second printing.
No, not until October
You
8th.
shouldn't bring any refreshments. Since we're providing the show, they provide the food. That's the way it works. That's just the way it works.
Printing is so these are the last copies we've done of this print.
You're gonna go grab
You want a chair over here?
No, I'll just sit here. So we're going to start off with acknowledgements, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll be the next slide.
Yeah. And then you will
And
talk
I'll
about.
I'll talk about what we put in the book, why, and then we'll go with starting the story about the news.
How it came
Yeah,
from Vermont, from
exactly. Yeah.
Let's spread these chairs out a little bit. Can you see from back here?
I don't think so.
No, I thought Rich was trying to do chairs. Are we okay where we are here? If I get too far over, I won't see over DJ.
And I'm going to put some more chairs right up along there.
Joanna, I'm going to be the chair right now.
You are? So should I stay?
I feel badly about
Okay, I can do this.
It's okay.
I can lean over to
I
that.
can't with him sitting.
I know, and it's okay, and he understands.
I hope so.
Yeah, no, he wants your talk to be a total success, so he left with a smile on his face. Yeah. No, I know, because I ushered him out the door.
Rich remembers me talking to him for years about
Well, I was trying to spread it out a little bit.
That's the
but
way to add it. Just
They,
give the walls.
They, yeah. And let's.
on this book over 50 years.
I know, but recently,
Recently, 2 years, Ellen Bishop came into my life and she said, you have to stop collecting and we gotta use what we have. So I
Quit
gave,
researching.
I stopped researching and I had 12 big file boxes of information. And I put it in the computer for her and then she started putting it together. And she's done miracles. I could never have done it myself. I collected so much stuff, going back over 100 years.
Somebody that did research first had to be done before they could throw it together.
Right, that's right.
yeah, you've been working a long time.
Very
Okay.
long time. Rich told me I talked to him about it 40 years ago.
Give up now.
Late comers.
Speeding right along.
Oh my gosh. It's been a labor of love. It really has been. But there's my daughter and my husband.
You just never know who will show up.
I know, I told my husband, please don't butt in with information.
Don't talk unless you're out.
It'll lose my train of thought. So, my daughter came to.
So you already signed a bunch of them, or?
Yeah, I have signed a bunch. I don't know. Are there any signed ones already? Available signed ones?
We want books that are signed. We don't want just any book.
Well, you'll have to bring it up to the authors to get it signed. And then there's the extra $10 charge.
Just kidding. Just kidding.
Hey, John, pipe down.
Well, there's people who are still coming.
Yeah, I think this is almost a record crowd here, Joseph. Oh my.
Jeff, you put about 3 chairs here.
That's great.
And they're, let's see. There's one here. We're gonna, pardon? Yep, one there's, yep, okay. And the other people can stand on their heads.
Oh, that would be hard.
Well, I can all sit up on the
Didn't know you
stairs.
were so popular, did you?
I didn't know this book would be such a success. It's been marvelous.
Actually, they only come for the free food.
Oh, I see. Oh my gosh. We had 250 copies and they sold that. in 2
Okay.
days.
Okay, welcome. So I usually do this, I just stand up here and, for a little bit while people keep coming in the door. Right? So I want to tell you, while we're waiting for Rita and Ellen, that our next show coming up is Saturday night, Joan Gilbert's show, 55 by 55. Joan has for 3 years decided that she is trading in her career as a graphic artist to be a fine artist. So she spent 3 years painting, sculpting, and it's a potpourri of different kinds of all centered on Wallowa Lake. So we're having a reception at 7 o'clock on Saturday night. Okay? And then I tell you also, I see that several in this audience maybe are not my peers, but gonna be my peers in a little bit.
And he's looking at Stevens.
We did a brown bag on advanced medical directives. And we did a follow-up workshop, and we had 17 people go through that and fill out their advanced medical directives and do all the stuff that you have to do with that. We're going to have on October 12th, whatever the Tuesday is there, Kathleen Bennett is going to tell us about what we don't know about Medicare. Because I would imagine that many of you here are on Medicare and don't know what Medicare covers and what it doesn't cover, and what supplemental might do or not do. So it's very important that we learn these things, right?
Right.
Okay, that's enough of my my extemporaneous stuff. The show coming up and the reception on Saturday night. Okay. So today we're very privileged to have Rita and Ellen here, and I'm going to do a brief introduction because about, what did we say, Rita? About 40 years ago.
When I talked to you.
Yeah.
But I found out just lately from a former employee 51 years ago.
Yeah.
She told me that I was working on the research. And I thought, oh my gosh, I forgot the extra 10 years.
Well, you did. You know, so 40 years ago, Rita and I got together and she had boxes of material, and I said, Rita, is there a theme in this? And she said, what do you mean a theme? And she said, well, you've got all this information about all these things that happened at Wallowa Lake. And she said, well, yeah, most of those people came up here and thought they were going to make a fortune and went broke. And I said, well, that's a good theme for a book. But at any rate, she's been working on this for a long time and collected a lot of great stories. And I have to tell you one more story. Where'd that, Joe's here, isn't he? Where'd he go to?
Joe, he's in
There he is. Here's something that you don't know about Joe, Rita, and Rich, and my ex-wife and good friend Judy, who's in here somewhere. Way before all these fancy menus that we have in Wallowa County now, we had a gourmet club.
We did.
Yes, once a month we would get together in somebody's house and we would eat. We weren't real adventurous, but we ate German and Swiss and Mexican and Turkish, and we rotated around. The Christmans, who else was in that? Bob and Billy Salzer? I
Yeah,
can't
the
remember.
Christmas I remember.
Yeah,
too.
Bob
They
and
were there.
yeah. Anyway, so we introduced fine cuisine to Wallowa County 50 years ago.
That was before Bally's.
Before Valleys, yes. And Ellen, I can't even remember when I first met Ellen, but worked with her on and off on so many projects I can't even think about it. And we've got an exciting one going now in Ethno Earth Sciences, which you'll hear about way later. But right now, Ellen came along when Rita had this growing box of material, of research.
12.
12
12
boxes.
boxes.
12 boxes. And Ellen helped put that together, and she got finished with her book, which is already, by the way, sold out. So I'm told that the next copies will be available on October 8th.
Yeah, we have sold out, but they went to stores.
Right.
So the different shops bought
Might
all
have
the
them.
books out.
Yeah.
So there might
So-
still be some out there.
Well, and so the Josephy Center has some copies. We brought some extra copies
Not
along.
anymore.
So
We just
if
sold them
anyone,
all, Ellen.
pardon?
We're sold out.
We just sold them.
You just sold them? Okay, so we brought some extra ones.
Oh,
Or
good.
Or you can go to the book loft. They have copies,
Okay.
and Heidi's has copies.
Heidi's has
So-
copies and Joseph.
After the presentation, come back to the start if you didn't get a copy, and we'll try to get you one there. Okay? Enjoy.
Thank
Welcome,
Thank
Rita
you.
and Ellen.
Thank you.
Welcome everybody, and I thank you so much for coming. This has been a long, long research project, but it's finally came to fruition, and I thank you so much for being here. I'd like to thank, sincere thanks to the many people who provided information, photographs, family histories, reviews, and much more to make this book possible. Especially my husband Joseph, my son Kurt, and my daughter Heidi Ehler, Reverend Etzel White, Nancy Rudger, who worked at the Chieftain and made me hundreds of copies of old records. Robin Parks, Lola Hopkins, who also gave me a lot of information. She wrote a book herself. Dr. Jude Graham, Wallowa County Museum, David Weaver, Wallowa County History Center, Jim Harbeck, Nez Perce Fisheries, Joe Dawson, Wallowa Lake Irrigation District, Rich Schneider, and the Josephy Center for Arts and Culture, and the hundreds more people that donated stories and pictures too.
Okay, so Rita basically collected a treasure trove of information from the past. She had many of her people who she worked with provide family histories of their businesses, and importantly, an awful lot of photographs that are that you'll never see anywhere else. So in the many stories, got to remember which is forward and backward on this thing. We have stories of the trains that brought people here, and the electric trains, in fact, that almost made it to Wallowa County. The elk and the restoration of elk, and the distribution of those elk across Oregon. The story of the sockeye and how sort of blunders by the Oregon Fish Commission ensured their extinction, and basically how the Nez Perce in particular are looking at bringing them back. The Wallowa Lake Dam and the recreation that occurred at Wallowa Lake. This is a photo provided by Lola Hopkins, which was shot in, I believe, the 1920s. I thought it was a pretty remarkable image for that time. Lots of boating on the lake and the excursion craft that plied the lake. The history of the Nez Perce, or the Namipo here, as well as the history of Old Joseph, Tui Caucus's initial life, initial burial, and then finally reburial, which you can see here. Wallowa Lake Lodge, and for that matter, the Wallowa Lake Amusement Park, the Edelweiss Inn, square dances, roller skating, lots of competition between different places at the park, including the Wallowa Lake Amusement Park and the Edelweiss Inn, or MJG Ranch, which Rita will talk about, and Valleys and the other restaurants and businesses that were there. So there's a tremendous amount of history that's associated with Wallowa Lake, and we thought it would be great to bring that to everybody here. So let's go take a look at some history. All right, Rita, take it away.
Okay. Matterhorn Swiss Village. Joe and I came to Wallowa County in 1965 to visit some relatives. The ones we were staying with in Portland were coming to see the relatives in Joseph. They're the ones that built the laundromat. Lawrence and Aggie Immos. My husband Joseph was born in Switzerland, and I was born in Canada. And we met skiing in Vermont in 1963. We were married in 64 and 65 after a terrible winter in Vermont. There was no snow, but it was bitter cold, way below zero. And so after the season, we decided we're going to go west. So we lost our car when he was in Montreal at a doctor's appointment. He got hit from two sides, a bus and a truck. And so we lost the car, and then we had to buy another car. We got a used car, and Joe built a trailer. And we headed west. Our relatives in Portland invited us. When we got there, they said they were going to Joseph to see our relatives that built the laundromat. So we hopped in with them and came for the July 4th weekend in 1965. And when we got here, we went for a picnic at Wallowa Lake, and And we looked at each other and said, oh my gosh, this is the place we've been looking for. We had gotten books from the A&P supermarket in Vermont, and I was reading those all the way. It took us 2 weeks to get to Oregon. And we said, oh my gosh, this is called Switzerland of America. So our cousin Aggie said, why don't you look at the cabin business, been for sale for 2 years and nobody bought it, and why don't you look at it? So we went there, and it was very run down. They had 4 rundown cabins. 2 of them didn't even have bathrooms in them. And the house was in not bad shape. It was a log house. And we said, well, there was potential there. So we decided to move there, but first we had to go back to Portland and work for 4 years. We had 2 jobs each, and we leased out the place for 4 years. And when we came in April, we gave the lady 2 months' notice, but when we got here, it was a snowstorm in April 1st in 1965, and we didn't know what to do, so we moved into one of the little tiny cabins, had no running water, the pipes were frozen. That's the cabin that we lived in. The store was not there. And the baby, I had a 1-year-old baby, and there was no running water, and it was so cold he slept in his snowsuit and his hat and mittens and scarf and a lot of blankets. And so she moved out about a week later, and we started remodeling the house and the 2 cabins, and we leased out the place for 4 years, went back to Portland and did 2 jobs each and saved every penny. We started an importing business in Portland, and then we moved there, and we worked a long hours. We opened in 1969 on the Memorial Weekend, and we had a lot of wonderful. Well, we built the shop. Our neighbor, Art Warsick, who was retired carpenter, he came and helped us. He was retired, and so he helped us build the store, which was a huge blessing to us. And then our friend Paul Aftermar from Switzerland was living in British Columbia at the time. He came and designed the sign on the road at the Matterhorn Swiss Village. We hung 4 different flags for our heritage. We had American, Canadian, Swiss, and Polish flag. And we had our grand opening in 1969. Did we have a picture of that? No.
No,
Okay.
skip right ahead to
We thoroughly enjoyed the wildlife on our property. We had a little buck who loved to sleep on the porch, and he was just like a pet dog. He was so friendly and so loving. So anyway, the following year, we adopted another little deer. It's a doe this time. It was a real tiny, she was very tiny, so we named her Baby. And Baby, she followed my son, was going down to the lake on his cross-country skis. It was January 1984, and it was only 12 degrees, very cold. She followed him down there, and she spotted there were 2 fishermen on the lake, and so she went out on the ice and broke through. And my son, took off his skis and ran along the shore, jumping over logs and rocks and everything, and crawled over on his stomach and got the deer out of the ice, which was amazing that he didn't fall through himself. And then when he got her out, he had help, for the 2 fishermen came and helped him get the little deer up the bank. And he took his jacket off and put it on the deer on her back to help thaw her out. She was totally covered with ice. And so he walked home in 12 degrees with just a t-shirt on. And when we got her home, we wrapped her in blankets and in a heating pad, and she thawed out. And then when she was thawed out, she decided to go back out again, and reluctantly we let her go because we couldn't keep her inside. And the next, I thought she'll never make it. But next morning, there she was on the porch looking for food. So, and his story was in the Chieftain on the cover, and in He-Man and Masters of the Universe, and another publication too. This is a picture of the idea for Alpenfest began in 1974, and my children, the little one is Heidi, and then my son Kurt, they were getting ready for Alpenfest, and we had 2 Alphorns, and we put honey on the one for the little one, and she pretended like she was playing, but she was eating the honey. So they were getting ready for Alpenfest. In 1975, that was the first Alpenfest. And a few years later, my husband Joseph talked to his brother, who's on the right, and his band. They brought all their instruments and everything from Switzerland, and they were at Alpenfest. And you can see the Alphorn in the middle. My son Kurt was blowing on the Alphorn, and we were all dancing, and the musicians were playing, and this was, I think Claggis took the picture. The year that we moved to the lake in 1969 and built the chalet, the gondola project was started, and we were very excited. We thought we'd see skiing come to Wallowa Lake, but they had a company, Duncan Brothers, came from Bend, Oregon, and they started putting in the towers. You can see them welding on the right. You can see the guys up there welding on the right. And they, unfortunately, it was unusual weather. They had warm weather, which is very unusual in June, and so they couldn't lift the heavy towers, especially the number 4 tower was extremely heavy, and so they had to hold off the project for a few days. And then the next year they came back and they got everything done and in, and we were hoping for skiing, but it never materialized. Valley's Alpine Deli, you probably have heard of this restaurant at Wallowa Lake. Mike Valley, oh no, that's my phone.
That's your phone?
Oh,
Okay, well, we'll
I'm
just scoot over
sorry.
here and
Oh no,
you just keep talking. Good.
I should have turned it off. Mike Valley lived in Hungary, and he watched as the Russians came in in 1945 and took over the family bakery. His dad was a baker of crusty breads, and his mom was a pastry cook. And they saw the Russians, and they knew there was no hope for them in their business. So he decided to flee in the Hungarian Revolution in the 50s. He rode through Hungary on his motorbike, and when he got near the border, the Russians caught him and they put him in jail. And they told him, don't try to do this anymore. And so a few days later, he hopped on a train for the border, and he jumped off the train before he got to Austria, and he walked through the forest for a long, long time, and he made it to Austria, and then to America. In the meantime, Maggie, her real name was Magdalena, and Molnar, and her mother and her uncle, they decided to try to get out of Hungary, and she was only 13 years old, and they just had the clothes on their backs when they left, and they walked it took them probably at least a week, and they walked and went from farm to farm and hid during the day and then walked at night, and they finally made it to safety. They made it across the border into Austria. So they met in Los Angeles, and they came across some flyers on Red's Horse Ranch in the county, and they were very interested, and they said, maybe we'll come and look it over. So they came, and we were having our grand opening at our store in 1969, July 4th weekend. And they came in and they saw our excitement, and they said, we're gonna go back to Los Angeles and we're gonna work, and then we'll buy something in a few years. And my husband Joseph said, no, don't do that, because if you wait a few years, the prices will be a lot higher. If you can buy something, do it now. So they decided to buy a cabin and a piece of land, and they went back to Los Angeles and worked for 4 years and saved their money, and then they came and they built the Alpine Delicatessen. This is Mike and Maggie at their restaurant. Their menu is very unusual. They decided they're only going to have one choice per night. They would be closed on Mondays, and they would have one choice per night, and only by advance reservations. And we said, and all the neighbors and the family said, you're never going to make it, you're never going to make it. And so they said they're going to do it anyway, they're going to do it their way. And the prices are so low, and they included coffee, tea, and a soft drink. So they did it their way, and they now are probably over 45 years in business. And they didn't make it, even though we told them they'd never make it. So it was very interesting. They had special Hungarian food, and people really liked their food. That's the family. Their 2 children, Mike on the left, Maggie, Monica, and Michael. The White Elephant Chalet. This was built by the Elks Lodge in about 1922. They built this lodge, and they snuck in gambling devices, and the state shut them down. So it became a White Elephant. And in 1926, Joe Hopkins on the right, he bought the place, all 100 acres, and the building, and he built corrals, and they held rodeos there, and they had roller skating in the hall and dances, and it was a very busy place. And they had reunions too, which it was a big enough place for a lot of people. And then here's they had the Dude Ranch. They called it the MJG after the White Elephant name wore off. They had that name, and I asked Lola, I said, what did that mean? And she said, it's a secret. And to this day, nobody knows the meaning. It's still a secret. and she's long gone. There's a group, a pioneer picnic in 1928. A lot of people used the building. It was, they had roller skating in there too, in addition to the dances.
There we go.
There's the White Elephant Chalet. The Catholic ladies are giving one of their globe chasing fun fest events. $1 for entry. And then they had the big band, they had probably 10 people in the band. Johnny Callahan, he came and played the whole summer one year. And they had a lot of dances going on, not just there. They had another hall down by the lake. It was called the amusement park. And they had a big building there, and they had bowling and dancing and roller skating. That was, they had bands, and then the MJG had bands, so they were dueling with each other. Each one was trying to outdo the other one. One would have 10 people, the next one would have 11 or 12. And so they were constantly trying to outdo each other. But both places were busy. And this is at the MJG ranch. They had rodeos on the weekends. And they had a lot of, you could see the old cars. It was in the early 30s. Did I miss anything?
No, I think you didn't miss anything.
Oh, well, good.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
So I was, basically, Rita asked me if I could help some with some of the more natural history things, and so I got involved in looking at sockeye salmon, the history of sockeye salmon, looking at the national park, looking at the history of elk, and some other interesting stuff that I thought I knew about, but discovered that I really didn't know all that much about after all. So, as we all know, sockeye salmon were a major portion of the fish in Wallowa Lake, and prior to 1880, according to a paper by Steve Kramer and Ken Whitty, published in 1998, they estimated from historical documents and other data that 20 to 30,000 sockeye and as many as 60,000 sockeye would migrate into Wallowa Lake each year, and to spawn each year. And so basically sockeye require a year or more after they have hatched in the calm waters and the food resources, mostly phytoplankton, to grow from hatchlings into smolts, or fry into smolts, before they migrate to the ocean. And as you'll see, basically the Oregon Fish Commission didn't really understand this at the time. But let's take a look at some of the other things that happened to sockeye before we get to there. So in 1880, pioneer families caught and canned about 1,500 fish per year. And there was Bill Warnock, basically, and Warnocks have been here ever since Wallowa County was settled by whites, basically wrote a little bit about what his family was doing. It says, we seined at this is in 1880, when Bill Warnock was 13. We seined at the mouth of the river at the head of the lake. One end of the seine, that's a net, was fastened to a tree. The other was hauled around the school of fish with a rowboat. Frequently, we would have to lift the seine and let some of the fish out in order to get the other end of the net to shore. It required a team and 8 men to drag in the haul, which usually contained 1,500 fish at an average of 5 pounds apiece. The fish were packed overnight in fresh water and were slimed the next morning. The sliming operation consisted of splitting the backbone and brushing the fish with a stiff brush, after which they were packed in 60-pound kegs and taken outside of town for sale. So that lasted until 1880. In 1881 and 1882, there were two commercial canneries at the head of the lake that captured and canned in both years an estimated 60,000 pounds of sockeye each year, which would be estimated at around 15,000 fish, which is an awful lot of fish, according to Kramer and Whitty, and would have been more than half of the returning spawners. So that was not a good thing for the sockeye population. And by 1904, sockeye salmon, according to Kramer and Whitty, and there are other estimates about when sockeye, whether in the lake or the river, were extinct, but effectively by 1904, sockeye were effectively extinct in Wallowa Lake. The main dam on Wallowa Lake was finished in 1916, at least the current dam. And so the sockeye were taken care of long before the current dam was built. So beginning in 1902, the Oregon Fish Commission, having noticed that there were no sockeye left, or at least not very many sockeye returning, decided that they would fix this. And the way they fixed it basically was initially, starting in 1902 and in 1903, putting what were called basically sort of fish, not really dams, but basically fish barriers across the stream, and catching the fish that were returning, particularly sockeye. And so they basically caught the remaining sockeye in 1901 and 1902, but particularly 1902. They caught 3,000 female sockeye, stripped 8.7 million eggs out of these fish, put 5 million of those eggs back in the river gravel, and then ultimately hatched 3 million of them and put those fry back into the river. Well, that's not an environment that sockeye can survive in at all. And so Kramer and Whitty's assumption was that the sockeye run was virtually wiped out during those 2 years through the bumbling efforts of the Oregon Fish Commission. And then things did not improve after that. In 1906, well, this is the process of spawning salmon, photo by William Finley, who also photographed all of the elk restoration. He was a wildlife photographer, but also a member of the Wildlife Commission. In fact, the head of the Wildlife Commission. So as the railroad is being built up the Wallowa River, there's a lot of rock that gets blasted out of the railroad right-of-way. So you can see here there's a big entrenchment that's still there. And what the railroad crews would do would be to take the rock and dump it into the river, and occasionally they got really, really ambitious and built dams. So this is not a dam that any salmonid could pass, and it was also part of, oh, come on, we can do this. There we go. Oh, we moved right along. Well, we'll just start here. So in 1903 and 1904, the Fish Commission decided that they would take advantage of this and catch any remaining fish, which they did, and then they established this hatchery, which is no longer there, on the banks of the Wallowa River. The idea being, again, to spawn the fish, mix the eggs and the milk, and produce fry within this hatchery area, and then put them back in the river. Well, for Chinook, and we have Jim Harbeck here, so I'm hoping that Jim will correct me if I wander off the path of truth here. But basically, the Chinook and the coho may have survived if their fry were put back in the river, but certainly not the sockeye. And then there's the dams that did exist on Wallowa Lake. In 1884, according to Grace Bartlett, a wooden dam was actually built across the outlet of Wallowa Lake, mostly to help divert water into irrigation ditches, sort of the first irrigation ditches. This picture was taken about 1905, and so this dam or something similar as a diversion dam may have been there as early as 1890. The dates are pretty uncertain in this, but nevertheless there were dams that were wooden dams on the lake fairly early, and then there were also, these are also William Finley photographs in 1912 when he came up here to help restore elk. There were these amazing wooden structures that were fish screens, and the idea was to keep the fish in the lake, because by that time there was a significant number of people who were coming here to fish. And there was also the stocking of eastern trout and ultimately lake trout in the lake, which dined on salmon fry, on sockeye fry, if there were any. So these were built to keep the fish in the lake so that none could escape and they could all be caught, and there would be a really good tourist season. There we go. So, and there's a trout hatchery over here. No longer there. So these are all things that I found interesting and pretty amazing. And there's a lot to the story of how the sockeye went extinct, and I'm really hopeful that when the existing dam is refurbished, that fish passage will be there. We don't know what kind of fish passage, but we're pretty sure, or at least the Nez Perce are pretty sure and optimistic that there will be fish passage. So there'll be a possibility of restoring sockeye, even though they won't be the native sockeye. But they will be easily adapted. And then I'd heard rumors that there was at one point a national park, or at least the attempt to do a national park here, but I could never find anything much out about it. And the reason was that there's hardly a murmur about a national park in the Wallowa County Chieftain. But if you go to the LeGrand paper, come on, we can do this. There we go. Here's a full-page ad by the Wallowa National Park Association in the LeGrand Observer in 1930. So, actually 1929, I'm sorry. So the idea basically, this is an idea that was hatched by a number of people, and I'm sure you can all read these names down here, right? They included basically Julius Roche, who was the man who built the Sacagawea Hotel building in LeGrand and was a major figure in LeGrand history, a county commissioner, a man who was into real estate. L.F. Anderson from Wallowa, Lloyd Harris of Lewiston, Howard Covey of Portland, and importantly, John McPherson, who's listed down here as of LeGrand, but McPherson, at the time all this was going on, was the manager of Wallowa Lake Lodge. And so what McPherson had drummed up with the Forest Service was the idea that there was a great opportunity for development and additional visitation to the community in the mountains in the Lakes Basin. And he had actually, I wouldn't say conned, but maybe convinced would be better, the Forest Service to allow a resort to be built, or at least cabins to be built at Moccasin Lake, which is the lake that's just below Mirror Lake. And so they were all for that. It was going to be initially a development of cabins with a store and with maybe a restaurant and some provisions for people, and it would just be a wonderful thing. As far as I know, that was never built, but there are photographs, evidently, of boats on Moccasin Lake and boats on Mirror Lake, long before it was ever an actual wilderness area or inaccessible area. So at any rate, these fine gentlemen from Portland, LeGrand, Walla Walla, and Lewiston were all about the economic development of the Wallowa Mountains. And so their idea basically was that, let's go to this slide. So they actually got a map and proposed 66,500 acres in the heart of what's now the Lakes Basin and the Eagle Cap Wilderness that included Mirror Lake, which is here. This is Steamboat Lake. This is Ice Lake. Okay, so here's the Lostine River. Here's Hurricane Creek. Here's the Minam River. There's Minam Lake. Glacier Lake is up here somewhere, right there. So they proposed this 66,500 acre national park in the middle of what's today the Eagle Cap Wilderness. And so their arguments were, well, you know, first of all, it would provide lots and lots of extra visitors, and all of the communities around here would prosper from this. You know, Joseph would prosper, LeGrand would prosper, and their idea, and they convinced the Forest Service of this pretty well, was that you could get easy access to these areas by coming up basically the Wallowa River. You could get easy access by putting a road up the Lostine River all the way up to Mirror Lake. Get easy access potentially along the Minam River all the way up to Minam Lake, or somewhere in here, where you could build another resort area, and conceivably up East Eagle Creek from the south side of the Wallowas. So they had big plans for developing this. Well, unfortunately for them, there's a lot of grazing in the Wallowas at that time, not of cattle, but of sheep. So there were an estimated, let me see if I get this, 193,000 head of sheep they estimated as the carrying capacity of the Wallowa National Forest. Okay. And so they claimed that if they excluded this area from grazing, which you'd have to do in a national park evidently, that would mean it would affect only 8,920 sheep. So they actually did all kinds of financial calculations and came up with the idea that the loss would be only $320 for the state of Oregon and a grand sum of a loss of $128 to the U.S. Forest Service. And what would be the harm in that if, in fact, you could bring in lots of visitors from Joseph and have resorts up here and water skiing on Mirror Lake or whatever else they had in mind. And so, unfortunately for them, there was a very strong, as there is today, a very, very strong presence of stock growers in Wallowa County, and wool growers in particular. And the stock growers and wool growers were headed by E.F. Johnson, who lived in Wallowa. He was the head of Stock Growers and Farmers National Bank in downtown metropolitan Wallowa, and the head of the wool growers, and he had been a county commissioner. And so he took on this wonderful group of entrepreneurs from the big cities, and basically lobbied the Oregon legislature, saying, you know, this will be the total financial ruin of all of Wallowa County. You know, we will never be the same. No one here will be able to eat. It'll be horrible. And so he basically convinced at least some of the legislators in the state of Oregon that this was a really bad idea. And the reason that was important was that this grand conglomeration of entrepreneurs from the big cities had convinced the head of national parks to fly over the Wallowas and sort of anoint this as the next national park. And he'd done that. And so their next step was to get the Oregon legislature to say, yes, this is a grand idea. We want a national park in the Wallowa Mountains. And they lobbied the legislature, and they got the Oregon Senate to agree to this. That was good. But the Oregon House of Representatives wouldn't approve it. And so that kind of put the kibosh on the whole idea of, yes, this is a unanimous thing, everyone in the state of Oregon wants it. And that was basically in early October 1929. And of course, as we all remember, the grand stock market crash was in late October 1929, and that sort of finalized the whole idea of a national park in the Wallowa Mountains. So this is McPherson. This is sheep grazing in Tenderfoot Basin in the Wallowas in 1938. And there was another attempt about 1935, but that also coincided with the second downturn in the stock market and a second downturn in the national economy that was known as Roosevelt's Depression, that started in 1936. And so we have been blessed with not having a national park there, courtesy of the wool growers and stock growers and the agricultural industry in Wallowa County. So that was something that I thought was really interesting. And then we have the electric railroad versus the steam-powered railroad. I mean, whoever knew that once upon a time we might have had electric railway service from here to Wallowa via Elgin. So
That's in the Jetsons. No.
So this is an Alco GEC Class S1 electric locomotive in 1907. And in the early 1900s, electric railroads were all the rage. There were electric railroads on the East Coast. This is, as you can see, New York City and Hudson River Line. There were electric railroads that hauled passengers and freight from New York City to Washington, D.C., across Pennsylvania, across Ohio. It was really a big and booming thing. Not so much here, although in there were electric railroads that hauled people from Portland to Salem and hauled freight from Portland to Salem in, again, the early 1900s. So this man, Frank McCulley, the first Frank McCulley, who was sort of the father of Wallowa County and is now interred along with old Joseph at the Indian Cemetery above Wallowa Lake, at the foot of Wallowa Lake. McCulley was a true entrepreneur. Not only did he have the first steamboat on Wallowa Lake, first stores, he had a branch of his stores in Flora, and I believe in Lostine. McCulley was a very far-sighted person. He built the first flour mill here. And when he did that, he suddenly realized that he had this big wheel that went around and around and around and is powered by water, and lo and behold, he could stick a generator on there and he could get electric power out of it. So he also established the Joseph Electric Company. And then he took the next step of thinking, wow, I have the Joseph Electric Company now, and we have more power than we know what to do with, so what would be the next step? Aha, I'll build an electric railroad. And so he found a variety of investors, mostly from Wallowa County, but some from Union County, who were interested in developing an electric railroad. And by 1905 or 1904, certainly the steam-powered railroad, the Oregon Rail and Navigation Company, was busily planning to put tracks up here. So McCulley and his associates got ahead of that, and they bought up a whole bunch of easements that went through the Wallowa Canyon, which stopped the Oregon Rail and Navigation Company from just being able to blissfully motor their railroad up the Wallowa Canyon. Still have to remember which is forward and backward here. Now, you would think that the Wallowa County chieftain would cover this, that it would be headlines, electric railroad plan for Wallowa County. Well, actually, I saw this in the Wallowa County Chieftain in a 1904 edition, and it was on like page 8 in a bunch of little tiny business briefs, one paragraph long. This is all the coverage that they got. So this says, W.J. Cook of the Wallowa Valley Railroad Company is in the city securing subscribers to the $150,000 subsidy which that company asked from this county as an inducement for them to build an electric railway from here to Wallowa. Mr. Cook feels confident that this amount can be raised and assures the people that the road will be built within 2 years. So their target date was 1906 to finish an electric railroad that went, and that's it. Then this goes on to the Enterprise Commercial Club had a meeting, and everybody was happy, and they had refreshments and whatever else they said. Okay. So $150,000 in 1904 is worth roughly $7 million today. So they had very high hopes, and McCully was had by that time, because he was one of the first settlers here, had become a very wealthy entrepreneur. So a year later, September 1905, here, a letter written by the general manager of the Oregon Rail and Navigation Company appeared in the Wallowa County Chieftain. And basically what they said was, first of all, if you know, dear Chieftain, if you want to publish this would be great, because we want to remove all doubt from the minds of those who have been inclined to discredit the report that the OR&N Company intends to build to this county at an early date. So because we had the electric railroad there, people were beginning to say, well, I don't know, maybe we'll just have an electric railroad, or maybe we won't have any railroad at all. And so people were beginning to get very, very unhappy with the whole railroad idea, or maybe discouraged would be a better term. And so J.P. O'Brien, and evidently it was really fashionable then to just use your first initials and not bother with the first name. J.P. O'Brien, Vice President General Manager, sent this letter to the chieftain. Dear sir, if you desire to do so, you are authorized to make the statement that this company will extend the Elgin branch to Joseph, and line will be in operation within 18 months or 2 years after we have matters in shape, so we can force our way through the canyon. You probably understand that condemnation proceedings covering right-of-way at points where we are being held up by the electric line people have been instituted and will come up before the court at an early date. This information can be considered official. Yours truly, J.P. O'Brien. So, and this is hard to trace down because there's very little in the way of records of what went on. So this is J.P. O'Brien saying the electric line people were going to sue the electric line people, and indeed they did. So I wandered over to the courthouse. This is from records October 1905, and we find these lawsuits were entered into the record. There was the case 165, Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company versus Frank D. McCully, Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company versus George Clark, Oregon Navigation Company versus Maggie Clark et al. George Clark is up here, and there's Maggie Clark again. So George Clark was actually an associate of Frank McCulley's, and Maggie was his wife, and they had strong interests in this railroad. And one of the things that's still pending is the courthouse finding those records, the record of actually what the lawsuit was, how much it was for, and who won the lawsuit. Because those records are in a little box somewhere in the basement of the courthouse, and we haven't found them yet, but we're working on it.
Cost $5.
Yeah, and it costs $5 to thank you, Rita, it costs $5 to file a lawsuit. So at any rate, the outcome, ultimately, this is in early 1906. We find this in the Chieftain. The surveying party for the Wallowa Valley Railroad was called off Monday, and the members of the party returned to the city Tuesday. The survey was completed to a point about 3 miles the other side of Lostine. So they never quite got to Lostine. It was deemed advisable by the company not to extend the survey any farther at present, as many routes can be secured for their road from Lostine to Joseph. And that's the last we hear of the Wallowa Valley Rail Company, at least the last dregs of dust that I can find. But I haven't given up yet. I mean, something has happened. So at any rate, the first train, the ONR, Oregon Rail and Navigation Company, ultimately prevailed. They ultimately got their easements through the canyon. They had lots of crews. Some of them they called Japanese, but I believe they were probably Chinese crews. They had German crews and Turkish crews working really, really hard. They endured an economic setback in 1907 with a small depression, but by September 20th, they had 1908, they actually had the first train. This is a picture of the first train coming across the Wallowa River. I'm sorry, that's the Grand Ronde River, on its way to Wallowa. And so they reached Wallowa in September. They got to Joseph finally in November 20th, 1908. And so history was made, and everybody was happy, and we're happy too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're
So,
done.
you're done?
Yeah, we're
Well,
done.
let's have some questions, huh, or comments.
Okay.
Questions out there, comments? Yes, Brad?
How does the electric railroad engine work? How does the electric engine?
That's way above my pay grade. I mean, it basically, electricity goes in, and then the wheels go around, and then it goes to track.
They didn't have a wire.
Lightning.
Yeah, no, they would have
Lightning,
wires.
Brad.
Yeah, they didn't have
Lightning.
they didn't have lithium batteries then, so they would have had to have strung wires all the way along. And my thought is that probably McCulley was thinking he would just put generating stations up the river to La Grande. How he was going to put generation stations up Phillips Creek to get up over to Wallowa, I have no idea.
So Ellen and maybe Jim can step in here, but the transition from Sockeye to Kokanee, okay, my understanding is, so those dams get built and that basically blocks the Sockeye from coming up, even the wooden dams block some.
What truly blocked the Sockeye from coming up was they were all caught and executed.
Well, yeah, but they also, that 1890 dam,
Yeah, that
They
didn't
got-
help.
but then there were some of the Sockeye then became the resident Kokanee, and there were a couple of other plants later, right?
There were,
Kokanee and Sockeye coexisted prior to the dam.
Oh, okay, okay,
So, and they were called, the Kokanee back then were called Yanks.
Mhm.
It was-
Okay.
We just yanked them.
okay.
Right.
So they
But then there
coexisted.
were a couple of other supplemental plantings of kokanee, right, from Kootenai Lake?
Yes, we screwed up the Kokanee.
Yeah, yeah, we're pretty good at that, you know?
Okay, so they were residents side by side.
Yeah, same way that steelhead and rainbow trout are
Okay.
the same species.
And I just learned from you or someone recently that there are also lake spawning kokanee and stream spawning kokanee. That was in the paper.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there was also the idea that there might have been two separate runs of sockeye, one of which
Oh.
spawned in the lake and the other of which
Okay.
spawned in the stream, so.
Did you also tell you mentioned in the intro that you also tell the story of the elk at the lake too,
Yeah,
in the
uh-huh.
book? Okay.
Well, no, elk in general, all the way from, coming
Oh,
from
okay.
St. Joe, Idaho to here, and then the elk who were here were transplanted, some of them were transplanted to Crater Lake, and some of them ended up in the Cascades over by Three Sisters.
But there was a resident elk population at Wallowa Lake for a while.
Yeah, and they were
Dangerous.
transplanted there, yeah.
They
Right.
got dangerous.
Pardon? They got
They
dangerous?
got
They got
dangerous.
They
dangerous?
got dangerous, but that was because they were essentially tortured. So, you know, you'd have small boys with BB guns or 22s and
Oh.
other people shooting the elk, and so some of the elk were blind, some of them had just been badly wounded, and so if you were in that category of elk and a human walked up to them, they wouldn't feel real friendly.
So Rita, what were some of the other favorite businesses that, when all these businesses that you traced, what were some of your maybe odd ones or favorite ones that started out and didn't make it, or?
Well, the lodge is in several stages. There
Uh-huh.
was the first lodge, and then there was the Wiggins family came in 1945, and they lasted over 43 years. And then they sold to the Lodham family, and they bought the lodge, and then they made, thousands of dollars of improvements. But he got arrested because he was money laundering with his, he had, what do you call those businesses, pawn shops.
Oh, right,
And he had those, and he was paying everything in cash here.
right.
And he got in trouble, and he lost the lodge. And then the attorney and Steve Larson took over.
Yeah.
And then they took over. And now the lodge has sold to a group
Yeah.
of local people, and they're running it now and doing a great job.
So I remember hearing a story, you talked about the amusement park, and I remember a story that there were women from the East Coast who ran a restaurant there, and it had linen tablecloths. And
Oh, they did.
And
Yeah.
people would come up,
The
they'd
Egan's
come on the
brothers.
train to Joseph, and then the buckboard, and then on the,
On the boat.
A
On
lot
the
of
boat?
them would
On
take
the
the
boat.
boats, yeah.
Yeah.
That was the Egensberger family.
okay,
They came in about 1908, 9, and then they sold in 1918.
okay.
They did everything without electricity, without phones, no cell phone, nothing. And they did a marvelous job. They had chambermaids that did the cleaning of they rented tents, and they had the merry-go-round that was all handmade, and they ran that, and they had dances, and they were extremely busy.
So they had gourmet meals before us.
They had gourmet food.
And they shared them.
And they're in the book with their dining room. They had
Okay,
Tiffany
good,
lamps,
good.
and one thing I forgot to mention: Lola and I Lola Hopkins with the MJG Ranch. We became really, really good friends in the 70s, and she wrote a book, and we would talk about all the different events that happened. And she said, I have an interesting story on a guy who came from Pennsylvania with his son. His name was what was his name? I don't remember. I don't remember.
Morris Green.
Morris Green and his son Bleecker. And he came and stayed for several months. He was collecting bats, and he would go to the lodge, which was empty at that time, and he would catch bats and then take them back to the MJG ranch, and he would work on the bats and collect them, and then he would send them to the University of Southern California. They had quite a collection already of his bats, and he kept sending them more bats, and he, that way he funded his education for his son, Bleecker. He was 12 years old at that time.
Well, we used to drive up there and see the bats flying out of the chimney at the
Yeah,
lodge.
that's where they were.
Yeah.
At that time that he was doing that, the lodge was closed.
Okay.
It wasn't running.
Okay.
So, but I thought that was an interesting story.
That's a great story.
The other thing I wanted to mention, and I forgot, when Lola retired, she did pen and ink drawings, and she sold them in our store.
Yeah.
I could pass these around her. She did these stories, and she also was a great artist.
Yep.
And she sold her paintings and her drawings in our store. I could pass them around.
And we sold them at the book loft too, her cards.
You did?
Yes,
Oh, gosh,
yes.
I did not know that.
And Lola also, oh, yes, back there. Janie.
Just had a nosebleed, I'm gonna live.
Pardon?
Oh, good.
Nothing. Anyway, Lola Hopkins and Bob Jackson and a few of us were the first art association in Wallowa County. We call ourselves the Wallowa Valley Art Association. We met in each other's homes, and Lola was wonderful. She was so talented. She could do the pen and ink. I have her books, by the way. There's collector's items, but do you have them reprinted?
Why? No, but I have copies up there if anybody wants to read Lola Hopkins.
Yeah, and she knew the story of the MJG Ranch. That was,
She also told the story, Joe, her husband, was Catholic, so Lola became Catholic. Lola was a Johnson
right.
of
In Wallowa.
in Wallowa, yeah.
Yeah.
Tiny Johnson, and if you remember some of those Johnsons, there were about 12 of them, I think. And Lola's husband, and so Joe told the story of the KKK coming to Enterprise and
Yeah, I
burning
read
crosses
about
on the
that.
hill in their anti-Catholicism,
She was married in Enterprise in 1931.
Yeah.
She and Joe, and when they left the church in Enterprise and came up to the MJG Ranch, which was then the White Elephant, she said that they were unexpectedly greeted with a whole bunch of people came, and they were banging on pots and pans and everything, and she said, oh my gosh, we weren't prepared for this, so we didn't have treats. So Joe put roller skates on everybody, and they roller skated till dawn, all the rest of the night. So that
Good.
was one of her stories.
That was one, yep, she was full of good stories. Okay, other stories out there that people remember, or stories you want to ask about? Okay, well, apparently we're going to have a few more books to sell here. Anne, why don't you deal with Ellen on figure that out? Can you do that? Huh? Because you know me and that machine over there, I can't do that. Okay. Thank you all very much for
Yes,
coming.
thank you.
And thank you, Rita and Ellen, for wonderful presentation.
So much.
Available to be viewed on our YouTube page. Inshallah.